That night, I, Aiden, realized that my connection to my son Cayden had crossed a line I could not have imagined. At 42, I was alone after losing my partner, but one unexpected conversation in our Seattle apartment changed everything. It's a story of struggle, temptation, and hope, a night that took the most insane turn in my life. My name is Aiden, and I'm 42, a Seattle-based interior designer who's spent the last 3 years trying to piece my life back together. It all fell apart when Jamie, my partner of nearly 2 decades, passed away. He was the glue that held everything together, not just for me, but for our son Cayden. Cayden's 22 now, a lanky art student with a mop of dark hair and eyes that sometimes looked too much like Jamie's. After the loss, he pulled away, retreating into his own world of sketchbooks and late-night walks. I didn't blame him. Grief does that, builds walls where there used to be bridges. Those first months without Jamie were a blur of silence. I'd come home from work to our loft apartment in Capitol Hill, the kind of place with exposed brick and big windows that Jamie loved, and find Cayden gone or holed up in his room. The air felt heavy, like the absence of laughter had thickened it. I tried to fill the void, cooking his favorite meals, like spicy ramen or blueberry pancakes, leaving little notes on his desk that said things like, "You've got this, kid," or, "I'm here if you need me." But he'd barely acknowledge them, just nod or mumble something before disappearing again. I told myself not to push. He was hurting, same as me. Then one evening, something shifted. I was in the kitchen, scrubbing a pan after a long day of client meetings. The loft smelled of garlic and soy sauce from the stir-fry I'd made, too much for one, but I always cooked for 2, hoping he'd join me. The floor creaked behind me, and I turned to see Cayden standing there, hands in his pockets, his hoodie slung low over his brow. "Need help?" he asked, his voice soft but steady, cutting through the hum of the city outside. I nearly dropped the sponge. It wasn't like him to seek me out, not lately. Sure," I said, recovering with a quick smile. "You can dry." I handed him a faded blue dish towel, one of Jamie's old ones, soft from years of use. He took it and stepped up beside me, his shoulder brushing mine as he reached for a plate. We worked in silence, the clink of dishes and the distant rumble of traffic filling the space between us. It wasn't much, but it felt like something, a crack in the wall he built. "How's school?" I ventured, keeping my tone light as I scrubbed at a stubborn spot. The Art Institute wasn't far, just a few blocks down Pine Street, but he rarely talked about it. "Fine," he said, not looking up, his hands moving slowly over a bowl. That was it. One word. I didn't push further, didn't want to scare him off when he'd finally come this close. "If you ever want to talk, you know I'm here," I added, glancing at him from the corner of my eye. He nodded, barely, and kept drying. When we finished, he hung the towel on the rack and lingered for a second, like he wanted to say something else. But then he just turned and shuffled back to his room, the door clicking shut behind him. I stood there, staring at the sink, the warmth of that small moment settling over me like a blanket. It wasn't a lot, but it was a start. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope, like maybe we could find our way back to each other, piece by piece. I didn't know then how much that night would unravel, how it'd lead us somewhere I never saw coming. But standing there, with the city lights glinting through the window, I let myself believe we'd be okay. After that night in the kitchen, something changed between Cayden and me. It wasn't dramatic, not at first, but I could feel it, like the air shifting before a storm. He started showing up more, not just hovering in doorways but settling into spaces I'd grown used to occupying alone. I'd be sprawled on the worn leather couch in our loft, flipping through design magazines or half watching some Netflix comedy, and he'd wander in, dropping onto the cushion beside me without a word. No explanation, just presence. At first I welcomed it. After months of silence, having him near felt like a lifeline. Our Capitol Hill apartment became a quiet stage for these moments. The big windows let in the gray Seattle light, casting shadows over the hardwood floors Jamie had once sanded by hand. Cayden would sit there, sketchbook sometimes in his lap, pencils scratching faintly as I pretended to focus on my work. Other times he'd ask about my day, small things, like how a client meeting went or if I'd found a new coffee spot on Pike Street. "You still obsessed with that oat milk latte?" he'd tease, a rare smirk tugging at his lips. I'd laugh, relieved to hear his voice lighten, and tell him about the latest hipster cafe I'd stumbled into. Then there were the evenings he'd join me in the kitchen. I'd be chopping onions or stirring a pot of chili, Jamie's recipe, heavy on the cumin, and he'd slide in beside me, offering to help again. "I'll dice the peppers," he'd say, grabbing a knife before I could protest. We'd work side by side, the rhythm of it almost easy, like we were rebuilding something we'd lost. He'd talk more then, about his painting classes, a professor who loved abstract chaos, or a gallery show he wanted to check out downtown. I'd nod, soaking it in, happy to see him open up. But as the weeks went on, I started noticing things that didn't sit right. The way he'd linger after we finished eating, his eyes catching mine a beat too long. Or how he'd sit closer on the couch, his knee brushing mine when he shifted, and he wouldn't pull away. One night, we were watching The Great British Bake Off, a show Jamie used to mock but secretly loved, and I realized his shoulder was pressed against mine, the heat of him seeping through my sweater. I edged over, just an inch, and he didn't move. Didn't even blink. Just kept staring at the screen, like it was nothing. "You're always working so hard," he said out of nowhere, his voice low, cutting through the sound of Paul Hollywood critiquing a soggy bottom. I glanced at him, caught off guard. "What?" "You," he said, turning to face me, his hazel eyes steady. "You're always running around for clients, cooking, keeping this place together. You never stop." His tone wasn't casual, it carried something heavier, something I couldn't place. I forced a chuckle, brushing it off. "That's what dads do, Cayden. Someone's gotta keep the lights on." But he didn't smile back. He just looked at me, unblinking, and said, "You deserve a break. Someone should take care of you for once." My chest tightened. It was sweet, wasn't it? Just a kid worried about his old man. But the way he said it, the way his gaze held mine, made my skin prickle. "I'm fine," I said, too quick, turning back to the TV. "Really?" He didn't push, just nodded and leaned back, but I could feel him watching me, even as the credits rolled. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, the hum of the city filtering through the cracked window, replaying his words. Was I reading too much into it? He was just being kind, grateful maybe, after all we'd been through. But those looks, that closeness, it gnawed at me. I told myself it was nothing, that I was projecting my own loneliness onto him. Jamie's absence had left a hole, and maybe Cayden was just trying to fill it too. Still, as I stared at the ceiling, shadows dancing from the streetlights below, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, something I wasn't ready to name. The unease crept in slow, like fog rolling off Puget Sound, thickening with every passing day. Cayden's presence in the loft had become a constant, comforting at first, but now tinged with something I couldn't ignore. He'd taken to hanging around more than ever, finding reasons to be near me. If I was sketching a layout for a client at the dining table, he'd pull up a chair, flipping through his own notebook, asking questions about my designs. "That's cool, Dad. How'd you pick the colors?" he'd say, leaning in too close, his elbow brushing mine. I'd smile, answer, try to focus, but my pulse would tick up a notch. It wasn't just the proximity. His words started shifting too, small compliments that piled up like stones. "You look good today," he'd say over breakfast, watching me pour coffee into Jamie's old mug. Or, "This place feels alive because of you," as I rearranged pillows on the couch. I'd laugh it off. "Thanks, kid, just doing my job." But the intensity in his eyes didn't match the lightness I tried to keep. It was like he was seeing me differently, and I didn't know why it made my stomach twist. One rainy Thursday, the tension snapped into focus. I was in the kitchen, prepping a quick stir-fry, soy sauce sizzling in the wok, when Cayden came in barefoot, his hair damp from a shower. "Need a hand?" he asked, stepping up beside me. I slid him a cutting board. "Chop the carrots," I said, keeping my eyes on the pan. We worked in silence, the patter of rain against the windows mixing with the chop of his knife. It felt normal, almost peaceful, until he stopped mid-slice and turned to me. "You've done so much for me," he said, his voice low, deliberate. I glanced over, confused. "What do you mean?" "Since Jamie," he said, his gaze locking onto mine. "You've held everything together. You didn't have to, but you did." His words hit like a punch, soft but deep. I gripped the spatula tighter, the heat from the stove suddenly too much. Of course I did, Cayden. You're my son. I love you. He nodded, but his eyes didn't waver. I never really thanked you. For all of it. His tone was raw, vulnerable, and it threw me. You don't need to thank me, I said, turning back to the wok, stirring harder than necessary. It's what I do. He didn't reply, just watched me, and the air felt thick, charged. I wanted to say more, to break whatever this was, but the words stuck. He picked up the knife again, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Dinner passed quietly after that, but his confession lingered, a weight I couldn't shake. Later that night, I was in the living room, flipping through a book on mid-century furniture, trying to unwind. Cayden came in and sat right beside me, not across the couch like usual, but close, his thigh an inch from mine. What are you reading? He asked, leaning over to see. I held up the cover, my voice steady despite the thud in my chest. Just some design stuff. Nothing exciting. Can I read with you? He asked, and I froze. It wasn't a big ask, but it hit me sideways. He hadn't cared about books since he was a kid, back when Jamie would read him comics at bedtime. Sure, I said, scooting over slightly. He didn't take the hint, just stayed close as I started reading aloud, some dry bit about Eames chairs. His shoulder pressed into mine, and I could feel his breath, slow and even, as he listened. But his eyes weren't on the page, they were on me. When I finished the section, I shut the book. That's enough for tonight, I said, standing too fast, my voice tight. Thanks for reading to me, he said, soft, almost tender. Night, Cayden, I muttered, heading for my room, the floor cold under my feet. I closed the door and leaned against it, heart racing. What was happening? Was I imagining this? He was my son, grieving, maybe lonely, but those looks, that closeness, it wasn't right. I climbed into bed, the rain drumming outside, and told myself I was overthinking it. But deep down, I knew something was coming, and I wasn't sure I could stop it. The days after that kitchen moment stretched thin, taut like a wire ready to snap. I kept busy, client calls, sketching layouts, scrubbing the loft's counters until they gleamed, but Cayden's words clung to me, heavy and unresolved. I never really thanked you. It played on a loop in my head, his voice low and earnest, those hazel eyes pinning me in place. I told myself it was nothing, just a kid processing grief, but the way he'd been lingering, watching, made my skin itch with something I couldn't name. I needed space, but in our Capitol Hill apartment, space was a luxury we didn't have. He didn't back off, not entirely. He'd still join me in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with that quiet focus, or sit too close on the couch during movie nights, his knee brushing mine like a question. But he'd gone quieter too, like he was wrestling with something inside. I caught him staring out the big windows sometimes, the gray city sprawl reflected in his eyes, and I'd wonder what he was thinking. I didn't ask. I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. One night I hit my limit. After dinner, some thrown-together pasta with sauce from a jar, I retreated to my room early, craving the solitude. The loft was too small, too full of him, and I needed to breathe. I curled up under the quilt Jamie's mom had made us, the lamp casting a soft glow over the book I'd grabbed, a thriller I'd been meaning to finish. The hum of the radiator and the distant thrum of Pine Street traffic lulled me, and for a moment, I felt the tension ease. Then came the knock. Dad? Cayden's voice was barely audible, hesitant, slicing through the quiet. I froze, spoke halfway to my lap, my heart kicking up. Yeah? I said, sitting up, dread curling in my gut. Can I come in? He sounded small, like the kid who'd crawl into our bed after a nightmare years ago. I glanced at the clock, 11:47 p.m. too late for this. Is something wrong? I asked, buying time. I just need to talk. His words trembled, and that was enough to crack me open. I sighed, setting the book aside. Okay. Come in. The door creaked, and he stepped inside, a shadow in the dim light. He wore an old hoodie, Jamie's, faded navy with a frayed hem, and his hands were shoved deep in the pockets. He didn't move past the threshold at first, just stood there, eyes on the floor. What's on your mind? I asked, patting the edge of the bed, trying to keep it light despite the weight pressing on my chest. He shuffled over, sitting slow, like he was afraid the mattress might break. For a minute he said nothing, just stared at his hands, fingers twisting the drawstring of the hoodie. Then he looked up, and those eyes, Jamie's eyes, hit me square. "I'm sorry," he said, voice cracking, "for making things weird." I blinked, caught off guard. "Weird how?" I asked, though I knew. I'd felt it building, the looks, the closeness, the way he'd hover like I was his anchor. "I know I've been different," he said, swallowing hard, "lately. And I don't want you to think I'm trying to mess us up. I just—" He stopped, breath itching. "I've been feeling stuff I don't know how to handle." My throat tightened. "Cayden," I started, but he cut me off, words tumbling out fast. "It's not your fault. It's me. After Jamie, you've been everything, and I don't know how to deal with it." His voice broke, and I saw the glint of tears. "But I don't want to lose you." "You're not losing me," I said quick, reaching out to grip his shoulder, steadying him as much as myself. "It's okay to feel mixed up. We've been through hell, you and me. But I'm your dad, Cayden. That's the line, and it doesn't move." He nodded, tears spilling now, and it gutted me. "I know," he whispered. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," I said softer, squeezing his shoulder before letting go. "We'll figure it out. Together. But just as dad and son, okay?" He wiped his eyes, nodding again, and stood, movements jerky. "Night, Dad," he said, barely audible, and slipped out, the door clicking shut behind him. I sat there, hands shaking, staring at the empty space he'd left. He named it, the thing I'd been dodging, and it was a relief, but it hurt too. I locked the door after him, climbed back into bed, and let the dark swallow me. Sleep didn't come easy, but when it did, I dreamed of Jamie, his laugh echoing through the loft, pulling me back to a time when the lines were clear. The air in the loft felt lighter after that night, but not clean, not yet. Cayden's confession had cracked something open between us, and though we'd patched it with words and promises, the edges still felt raw. I woke the next morning to a quiet apartment, the kind of stillness that hums with aftermath. My head throbbed from too little sleep, my mind tangled in what-ifs and half-formed regrets. I shuffled to the kitchen, brewed coffee in Jamie's old French press, and stood by the window, watching the drizzle streak the glass. Cayden's door stayed shut, and I let it. Space, I told myself. We both needed it. He emerged later, bleary-eyed but composed, and joined me for breakfast, cereal, nothing fancy. We didn't talk about it. Didn't need to. He crunched through his cornflakes, scrolling his phone, while I sipped coffee and pretended to read the news. "Got class today?" I asked, voice casual, testing the waters. "Yeah, figure drawing," he said, glancing up with a faint smile. "Should be fun." It was normal, almost painfully so, and I clung to it like a lifeline. He left for the Art Institute after that, backpack slung over one shoulder, and I watched him go, relief mixing with a strange ache I couldn't place. The weeks that followed were a slow thaw. Cayden pulled back, not in a cold way, but like he was finding his footing again. He'd still sit with me some nights, but the couch felt less crowded, his presence less heavy. He started talking about school more, his latest painting, a critique that pissed him off, a friend who dragged him to some dive bar on Broadway. I'd listen, nod, throw in a joke when I could, and it felt like we were rebuilding, brick by brick. The look stopped, mostly. The hovering too. But I'd catch him sometimes, staring out those big windows, lost in thought, and I'd wonder what lingered behind his eyes. I kept busy too, threw myself into a new project, a sleek condo redesigned for some tech guy in Belltown. It was a distraction, a way to keep my hands moving and my mind off the fault lines we'd danced around. But at night, alone in my room, the quiet pressed in, and I'd replay that late-night talk, his tears, my resolve, the way I'd held the line. Had I done enough? Too much? I didn't know, and the not knowing gnawed at me. Then came the evening that settled it. It was a Saturday, the sky bruising purple over the Sound, and I suggested we walk to Cary Park. Cayden shrugged. "Sure, why not?" And we grabbed jackets, stepping out into the crisp air. The city sprawled below us as we reached the lookout, lights flickering on like stars against the dusk. We sat on a bench, the wind tugging at our hair, and for a while, we just watched, Olympic mountains fading into shadow, ferries cutting slow paths across the water. Thanks, he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I turned eyebrows up. For what? For being patient, he said, his voice steady but soft. For not pushing me away when I was messed up. He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw something new in his face, clarity, maybe, or peace. You've done everything for me, Dad. Even when I didn't make it easy. My throat tightened, but I kept it light. That's the gig, kid. Comes with the title. I laid a hand on his shoulder, firm but gentle. You don't have to thank me for that. He smiled, a real one, not the half-there ones I'd gotten used to, and it hit me hard. I know, he said. But I want to. For sticking with me. For everything. His voice dipped, and I knew he meant it all, the grief, the confusion, the nights we'd stumbled through. You saved us both, I think. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just squeezed his shoulder and let the moment sit. We stayed there, the city humming below, until the cold chased us back home. The walk was quiet, but good quiet, the kind that doesn't need filling. Back in the loft, he grabbed his sketchbook and sprawled on the couch, pencil scratching away, while I brewed tea and let the warmth seep into my bones. Lying in bed that night, the radiator clanking softly, I turned it all over. We'd made it through, bent maybe, but not broken. I still wondered sometimes if I'd handled it right, if drawing that line had cost us something we couldn't name. But as I drifted off, Jamie's laugh echoed in my mind, warm and steady, and I thought maybe, just maybe, we'd found our way back to solid ground.